I've been on the trail of a mystery lately, and I'm going to give you the whole trail, but then I'm just going to delve into one particular issue, one crucial issue. So the trail is that in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, the May 1826 edition, I have to go by my notes, it's really complicated. There's a story called The Metempsychosis, which of course means reincarnation. It's signed by a modern Pythagorean, and Pythagoras was one of the ancient Greek philosophers who taught reincarnation. And it's claimed by a Scotsman named Robert McNish. Well, I've determined that Robert McNish, like many other people, this being the first one, plagiarized Matthew's works and got famous off them. So this particular work made him famous when he claimed it. Probably he got it somehow. Matthew had sent, Matthew's 13 years old, and he had apparently sent at least 3 stories overseas to somebody for their perusal and their feedback, and Robert McNish got hold of it, probably with somebody in a university, and Robert McNish got hold of it, submitted it to Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, which was one of the big ones, and he got famous. That was his entry into the literati of Scotland, see? So then, in the same magazine, Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, in the August 1826 edition, there's another piece which I say is Matthew's, The Man with the Nose, signed, again, by a modern Pythagorean. Now, there's lots of reasons why I believe these are Matthew's. I can't go into all of that, but I've analyzed them in detail, and I can compare them with Matthew's work as a teenager and even his work as a 13-year-old, and I can show that he could have and probably did write these pieces. Then in the same magazine, the October 1826 edition, and there's a third one with this same signature called The Barber of Göttingen. It's set in Germany. And that one is crucial because it prefigures a piece signed Trismegistus in that same magazine called The Unbidden Guest. And that was Matthew at 23 years old. So going back to the Barber of Göttingen, the next thing we see is the New England Galaxy in Boston, the February 29, 1828 edition, 2 years after these pieces appeared in Blackwood's. And it's signed Trismegistus. It's a kind of a satirical essay called Ideas on Poetry. Matthew's 15 years old. It's very sophisticated. Simply shows that he was capable of writing at that level, and that he first used the signature Trismegistus, which of course is a reference to Hermes Trismegistus. And this was identified as Matthew by the editor, Joseph T. Buckingham, in his 1852 memoirs. He disguises Matthew's identity slightly, calling him Moses Whitney, but all of the descriptions, there's like 3 different idiosyncratic descriptions that identify this as Mathew Franklin Whittier. So that was Matthew in February 1828 in the New England Galaxy in Boston, which was also a major literary newspaper, signing as Trismegistus. So he had signed back in 1826 by a modern Pythagorean. Robert McNish had stolen it, but now 2 years later in 1828, Matthew was again writing as Trismegistus, which is another one of the ancient Greek philosophers. Now, the reason Matthew signed as these ancient Greek philosophers is that young Abby, who was 4 years younger than him and was a prodigy, brilliant prodigy, was tutoring him, and she was introducing him to the ancient Greek philosophers and ancient Greece in general, the classics, but she was trying to introduce him to metaphysics because she was a student of metaphysics. And he was skeptical, so he would write satirically, and he would adopt these pseudonyms satirically. But it was never Robert McNish who had an interest in Pythagoras and metempsychosis. That was young Mathew Franklin Whittier. So again, I got evidence for all this stuff. We don't have time to go into it. We're talking a 5 or 6 hour video. None of you would watch a 5 or 6 hour video, but if you want the evidence, look in my books. Now, in the New York transcript, which Mathew Franklin Whittier was contributing to heavily in 1835, 1836, excuse me. So this is reprinted from the New Haven Herald in the June 29, 1835 edition of the New York Transcript is a satirical poem arguing against vegetarianism, signed Trismegistus. So Matthew used that same signature and inserted it into the transcript from the New Haven Herald in 1835. And then 1 year later in Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, again he uses Trismegistus in this story, The Unbidden Guest, in the April 1836 edition. As I said, he's now 23 years old. Now, 8 months after this appears, we see the 29th chapter of the Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens, published in the December 1836 edition of that series. It's called The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton, and there are very strong similarities between The Unbidden Guest and this story. So The Unbidden Guest appeared in Blackwood's. Charles Dickens would almost definitely have seen it and been influenced by it. But there's another story that shows up in here by Matthew, and that is something called The New Year's Bells. Apparently, Charles Dickens had also seen The New Year's Bells, which didn't get published. So I'm guessing that Matthew had submitted two stories in Europe. One of them was The Unbidden Guest. It had, in fact, gotten published in Blackwood's Edinburgh Magazine, the April 1836 edition. But he had also apparently submitted The New Year's Bells, maybe to a paper or magazine in London. It had not gotten published, but Charles Dickens had gotten hold of it. So when Charles Dickens wrote The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton and published it in December 1836, he had been heavily influenced both by The Unbidden Guest, which he almost for sure had seen, and The New Year's Bells. Now, The New Year's Bells is the story which I believe Mathew and Abby Whittier used as their template when they wrote the original treatment of A Christmas Carol. So it's a very complicated trail, but when Dickens wrote his version of A Christmas Carol, he was actually working, I believe, from the manuscript that Mathew and Abby had written. And they had started from The New Year's Bells. But Charles Dickens had also been influenced by The New Year's Bells when he wrote The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton. And that is taken to be Charles Dickens' precursor to A Christmas Carol. But Charles Dickens was borrowing from Mathew Franklin Whittier's work early in 1826, and he was using their manuscript and reworking their manuscript in 1843 when he published his version of A Christmas Carol. So none of it was original to Charles Dickens, with maybe one or two little elements, that Dickens may have added. But basically he was taking these stories, The Unbidden Guest and The New Year's Bells, and he amalgamated them into the story of the goblins who stole a sexton. And then Mathew and Abby started from The New Year's Bells, which Mathew had written many years earlier, and wrote their version of A Christmas Carol. Mathew handed that manuscript over to Dickens in Boston in 1842, January 1842, and Dickens revised that and reworked that for his published version of A Christmas Carol. So that's the trail. But The New Year's Bells, where I found it, was where it was published by Francis Durivage in 1852, many years later, like 9 years after Christmas Carol was published. And that's in a book called The Three Brides, Love in a Cottage, and Other Tales. So I know that that's Matthew's because I proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Francis Durivage and his moneybags partner, Charles Pickering Burnham, swindled Mathew by a bogus contract out of a vast portfolio of unpublished work by Mathew, probably in early 1848. But it's hard to prove. I've proven it by a preponderance of the evidence. So what I want to do now is to show a smoking gun that essentially proves that Durivage plagiarized Mathew Franklin Whittier, and therefore that The New Year's Bells was not Francis Durivage's work. It was Mathew Franklin Whittier's work, which by style was written many years earlier, because it's in a science fictionish, moral science fiction style, which Mathew was writing in from like the early 1830s, 1830 up until maybe 1835 or 36, somewhere in there, well before Christmas Carol was published, and for that matter, before Charles Dickens published the story of the goblins who stole a sexton. So in order to do that, I'm looking at a story that Matthew had written back in 1830, published back in 1830, and then reworked, which apparently sat in his portfolio, which Francis Durivage stole. And all of this is predicated on my discovery that Matthew would plagiarize himself effectively. In other words, he would come up with an idea and publish it, and then he would say, you know, I can improve on that. And he would get ideas to do an even better version. So what he would do is to start with that piece that might have been published 5 or 10 years earlier and rework it and create a new story based on the same theme and then publish that. So you can call it self-plagiarism if you want to. I think of it as him wanting to improve work that he had done previously. There's nothing too unusual, or I don't think there's anything unethical about it. But the fact that he had that habit is very helpful for us when he's plagiarized, because if someone plagiarizes a later version and we find an earlier version that definitely was Mathew Franklin Whittier's, or that I feel was definitely his, we've got a very strong clue that the second plagiarized one was in fact Matthew's also, because there's this pattern of him reworking. Of course, it has to be very similar in order to claim that. So we have one that's very similar. And this is a story which I don't have a physical copy of. I found it reprinted in the Burlington Sentinel, and it's the February 12, 1830 edition. It's reprinted from the New England Galaxy. Matthew was a heavy contributor up through late 1829, possibly as early 1830. He had moved up to New York City and started writing for the New York Constellation, which very soon he became the de facto editor, associate editor of. But he was still probably submitting to the New England Galaxy, which he'd been doing for several years, or it had been left on file, either way. So probably it was published in the New England Galaxy in very early January 1830. Anyway, it's called Tale of a Training, or A Chapter of the Adventures of the Massachusetts Militia. Now, Matthew was raised Quaker. He was anti-war. He many times ridiculed what they called military musters, the practices and reenactments. So this is a story of the reenactment of the Battle of Yorktown, of General Cornwallis on the British side and General Washington on the American side. And Cornwallis lost, and they would reenact this thing just like they reenact Civil War battles today. Well, Matthew made fun of it. And in this story, he starts out with a courtship tale, and Matthew always drew from his own life very heavily. His works are very heavily autobiographical, to the point where he would take actual events from his life, disguise them a little bit and write them as fictional stories. In this case, it's not quite so close, but there's elements of himself in it. There's an unrequited love. He's described as being like the favorite of the village, very popular, but there's one girl that didn't want him, and that's the one he wanted. Well, that was all autobiographical. It wasn't Abby, his future wife. This was another girl, and I think I know who she was, but it's not relevant here. But anyway, it starts out with this tale of a courtship, and the main character, decides that he can get the girl if he becomes the head, the captain at the military muster, if he leads as General Washington. Well, all doesn't go to plan, because they requisition a pigsty and move the pigs somewhere else, and that's their headquarters, their fort. But this huge 400-pound sow, and I don't know much about pigs, but I know when they get to be 400 pounds, they can be formidable. Well, this is a mean one, and she had gotten loose and fattened herself up in the fields and then come back and gone to sleep in her old pigsty, see? So right in the middle of the heat of this reenactment battle, when they're firing off their guns and yelling and screaming, the sow wakes up and chases them all out, see? So, in other words, the reenactment didn't go as planned. Well, that's the 1830 version. I'll read a little bit of it here. Let's see, I'll go down to where it all goes wrong. But the roaring of the musketry, and the rolling of the drums, and the shouting of the multitude, and the trampling up and down of Lord Cornwallis and his soldiers upon the citadel of Yorktown, at length aroused the snoring animal, and she opened her eyes with a most significant grunt, wondering what could keep this dreadful pother over her head. Getting up and poking her snout into the open air, she found her peaceful domicile filled with men of war, making such a racket and tantara as were enough to drive any hog in the universe crazy. No hog could be more hoggish than the one of which we speak. She was a cross-grained, snappish, and as malicious a piece of pork as the country for 10 miles round could show, and more than that, she was of about 400 pounds weight. In an instant she sprung among the enemy and knocked down a platoon of them before anyone was aware of the new assailant. The next instant she butted an aide-de-camp out at the sally port and gave Lord Cornwallis a grip in the rear at the slack of his pantaloons, which ruined that part of his regimentals for ever and aye. His lordship sprang over the walls in a jiffy without waiting for his suit, and the whole garrison was put to the rout in the twinkling of an eye. Some threw themselves over the ramparts, others climbed up the bastion, others scuttled off the half-moon, the fierce animal meanwhile rooting hither and thither among them, knocking down and biting and scratching and kicking at a most terrible rate, and so on. That's Mathew Franklin Whittier. It's not signed. I'm 100% certain that's him. I've got a bunch of stories to compare that to. So there's Mathew writing about a reenactment of the Battle of Yorktown gone awry in 1830. Now, it so happens that Francis Durivage, who was using a pseudonym, the Olden, which pseudonym he borrowed from Mathew, that phrase, saw fit to publish in the, and let's get my notes. It's the May 17, 1851 edition of Gleason's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion. And this is the volume right here. And let's see, I need a pillow, so hold on a minute. Okay, so May 17, 1851 edition. We have here Surrender of Cornwallis. Now, this is very similar in theme. We have military, a militia reenactment of the Battle of Yorktown, and it goes awry, and it's a shorter piece. The reason it goes awry is that the people on the British side get fired up and lose sight of what they're supposed to be doing in the reenactment, and they win. So Cornwallis wins when he should have lost, see? I'll read a little bit of that. This is where Mathew is using his trademark dialect, in Yankee dialect. "Fellow soldiers," roared the temporary father of his country, "yonder stands Cornwallis in his red coats, only they hain't got red coats, particularly them in blue swallertails. We are bound to lick 'em. Hurrah for our side. Go inter 'em like 1,000 of bricks fallen off a slated roof. The genus of American liberty, in the shape of the carnivorous eagle, soaring afot on diluted pillions, seems to mutter e pluribus unum. We are one of 'em. Hail Columbia, happy land. Sing Yankee Doodle, that fine tune. Cry havoc, and let loose the dogs of war." Now that's Mathew Franklin Whittier, the satirical anti-war fellow who was raised Quaker. It's not Francis Durivage, okay? Then commenced the horror of the sham fight. The Continental guns opened in thunder tones. The British artillery hurried back their terrific echoes. Bang, bang, boom, boom. The canopy of heaven was stained with the sulphurous smoke. The drummers rattled away on their sheepskins. The fifers distended their cheeks till they resembled blown bladders. In the midst of all this noise and tumult, the undaunted Slorkey and the indomitable Jalop rushed to and fro with clanking scabbards and brandished scythe blades, twin thunderbolts of war, and so on and so forth. "I've got a grudge against the colonel," said the major, "and if you'll stand by me, I'll take it out of him. What say?" "Agreed," was the spontaneous response. while Slorky was waiting for the covenanted flag of truce. He saw the hated Peasley in his stirrups, and heard his stentorian voice roar out the word "Charge!" A deafening shout answered his appeal. In an instant, Hardscrabble and its allies were down on Dogtown and its defenders. The latter stood it for a moment, but Peasley knocked the major off his horse. The surgeon had his nose pulled. The Dogtown Blues justified their name by their looks, and seized with a sudden panic, fled ingloriously from their native training field. The audacious outrage was consummated. History was violated, and General Washington was beaten by Cornwallis. Okay, so it's the same author. He's just taken a little bit different twist on it. Instead of a pig causing all the problems, it's a personal jealousies and personal enmities among the leaders of the reenactment, and he goes against history and decides for his side to win. See, now, therefore, that was never written by Francis Durivage. Okay, it was written by Mathew Franklin Whittier, who had written a precursor to it in 1830 and published a precursor to it in 1830. Now, why he never published this version, I don't know. Maybe he decided that the other one was better, and actually wrote them around the same time. I don't really know. However, there's more to this story a little bit, and that is in the April 17, 1852 edition of the Carpetbag. I have to go back and say that Mathew was an investor in the Carpetbag, a heavy investor apparently, and a heavy contributor to this newspaper, far more than historians have any idea. I found one edition, they're weekly editions, they're 8 pages, and he had contributed 8 of the pieces, okay, to this one edition. So that's how prolific he was and how heavily involved he was in this newspaper. Charles Farrar Brown, who has been called the first stand-up comedian and became famous largely by imitating Mathew's character Ethan Spike, he was an assistant printer at this time as a boy. I think he was 15 years old, okay? So he wrote a version of this same story. He reworked this story that I just read from and inserted it without the editor's permission as his own piece into the Carpetbag. And that was his start in life, in literary life. Okay, so the question is, how did he get it? Did he randomly pick it up from Gleason's Pictorial, like a year earlier? Or did Mathew share it with him by way of mentoring? This is what I believe would happen, is Mathew would mentor young writers and show them copies of his unpublished works, and they would plagiarize them. So what happened here is that Charles Farrar Brown got his start by reworking something that Mathew had showed him, and then he inserted it without the editor's permission into the Carpetbag. Now, Shillaber, the editor, was pleased, and he was praised for it. So Mathew may not have had the heart to tell the editor, "Oh, this was actually mine. All he did was rework it." Now, apparently Shillaber was not aware of what was going on in Gleason's Pictorial a year earlier. But anyway, that's in my awkward way. That was what I wanted to show, was that this material published by Francis A. Durivage in 1852 in The Three Brides, Love in a Cottage, and Other Tales, which includes, as the next to the last piece, The New Year's Bells, was not written by Francis Durivage. It was written by Mathew Franklin Whittier. Everything in there except the title piece, The Three Brides, I think was written by Mathew Franklin Whittier, or almost everything. So that means The New Year's Bells was Mathew's. By style, it goes back to the early 1830s, I would say, 1832, 1833, 34, maybe as late as 1836, but I would say that it probably predates Dickens' The Story of the Goblins Who Stole the Sexton, which means that Charles Dickens could, in fact, have used that one, The New Year's Bells, which he got hold of, maybe it was unpublished in England somewhere, and The Unbidden Guest, which he almost for sure would have seen in Blackwood's magazine 8 months earlier. See, so Dickens used both of Mathew's stories to create the story of the goblins who stole the sexton, which people think is his precursor to A Christmas Carol. It wasn't. He was just reworking and incorporating elements from two of Matthew's early stories.